assume we're on. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Bay Area Mini League Day, focusing on State Route Highway 37. I'm Madeline Cronenberg. I'm the president of the Bay Area League of Women Voters. This is our first Mini League Day. What this is we have an annual event that's a League of Women Voters event where we have an entire day, a league day, devoted to a topic of interest to the league. This particular day is a little shorter, and that's what makes it mini, but I think we're going to do more of these so that more things are covered in the future. This particular event is the child of one of our board members, and I do want you to recognize her because without her this absolutely would not have happened, and that is Vida Flores. So please join me in thanking Vida. She made this happen. And in addition to those of you here in the room with us today, this is being live streamed to the families in Novato this morning. So good morning to Novato. And it will then be available to everybody later when we get a link so that we can send it out and share it with others. Because I think the information we're going to get today about Highway 37 is incredibly important. I am going to be the moderator, but I am not at all an expert on any of this. So at the end of the day, when we get to the Commissioners' Roundtable, I'll be relying on you to have questions for the commissioners, and we can move ahead with the questions that you might have regarding everything we're going to learn before that. The other thing I want to make sure you know about is our Bay Area Monitor. The Bay Area Monitor was in your packet, was packaged with the Bay Area Monitor, and this is our league's effort to communicate about matters that the league is really interested in. This goes out on a regular basis. It can be mailed to you. You can also go online and find it. And it covers many, many issues, including, as you can see, Highway 37. The planning for the future is right here on the first page of the Bay Area Monitor today. Also, this topic has been covered in Insight, which is the opinion of the San Francisco Chronicle, and it is rebuilding State Route 37, berm, bridge, or causeway. It's an issue that is very important to everybody in the Bay Area, which is why we, as the Bay Area League, took this on. So, I want to thank you all for coming, and now our opening speaker is Judy Arnold. And here is Judy. She is a Marin County Supervisor and has a lot of background on this topic.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area for putting this on, and thank you especially to Vida. Good job. I just want to give you a quick background. In 2015, the transportation authorities of Marin, Napa, Solano, and Sonoma counties formed a policy committee to begin working to address impacts from sea level rise, flooding, and increased traffic congestion along Highway 37. We had no idea then that 37 was going to be closed in Marin, flooded for 21 days. So it's a good thing we did start in 2015. We have come a long way since first joining together in 2015, and after many public meetings and collaborations with the counties, we now can point to three things as far as where we are now. We now have studied the corridor more thoroughly. We are set up to receive Regional Measure 3 funds that will allow us to embark on a formal process for assessing impacts through an environmental document. And number 3, we are beginning to review improvements and projects in greater detail. While we have made a lot of progress since 2015, there is still a lot of work ahead. Community outreach and discussions need to be had on what this project will look like and how it will be funded. There have been some press lately regarding the possibility of a toll road. That is one of the financing options that is being considered, but no decisions have been finalized. We have some great speakers and panelists here today that will get more into the specifics and lead us in a good dialogue. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you in the audience today. I want to acknowledge Novato City Council member Eric Lukens here, and I know one of the panelists is Solano County Supervisor Jim Spering, who's really a leader in this 37 issue. So thank you all for joining us, and let's get on with the show.
Okay. Well, the next part of the show is the presentation from Mr. Moore. So, let me just tell you. Yes, yeah, Mr. Moore, come right on up.
You don't have to do the bio thing.
We won't do the bio. You can read the bio. There you go.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Madeline, and it's an honor to be here with Supervisor Arnold and City Council person, and thanks for this opportunity to talk about State Route 37. Now, I am the Vice Chair of the State Water Board, and you might ask yourself, why would I be interested in this issue? Well, I am a Marin County resident, too. And before I was on the State Water Board, I'm a civil engineer, and I worked for many years here in Marin County at Nuygen Engineering, worked for Novato Sanitary District, and I was also on the Regional Water Board. And back in 2011, I participated in a stakeholder process that Caltrans actually sponsored for Highway 37, and the Road Ecology Center and Fraser Schilling, who is like a co-author of this presentation and was originally invited to speak, but he's on vacation. He helped lead that stakeholder process. So yes, the transportation agencies have been working on this for a few years. There was actually an effort that preceded that effort that I was part of. And so I look at this from both through the lens of the Water Board and its permitting processes, its funding processes, and as well as a lens of a civil engineer with experience in the corridor, actually. I've designed drainage projects in the Novato Sanitary District lands. So we know it's really an important issue, and it's such an important issue that when I was appointed to the State Water Board, I called a meeting with the Director of Fish and Wildlife, Chuck Bonham, and the Director of Caltrans, Malcolm Doherty, and we held a meeting in 2013, and we talked about Highway 37, and I was just come out of that stakeholder process, and what Fish and Wildlife and the Water Board said to Caltrans, and we're meeting again in November to talk about this project as a follow-up, is this is a wonderful opportunity. So I'm just telling this story about how we're going to continue the dialogue at the state level, and just wanted to emphasize the statewide significance of this corridor. It's not just a transportation issue, it's a water resources issue, it's a flood management issue, it's a climate adaptation issue. And that's kind of an overview of my talk today. I wanted to emphasize the statewide significance of the 37 corridor, not just dealing with serious transportation issues, but ecosystem restoration opportunities that go hand in hand with adapting to sea level rise. And I wanted to share some of the history of the Highway 37 stakeholder planning that have been done to date. The Road Ecology Center has been studying shoreline changes over the last few years. I wanted to share some of those photos and studies with you, and share some regulatory considerations on how we permit this project and how we can design it in a partnership way, looking ahead to make things a lot more efficient down the line, but also to have the shared vision. And really, I think that's the key, is to have a shared regional vision of this whole area that is affected by 37. I want to point out in my presentation, in the existing setting, it's not okay. The road as designed is not okay from the standpoint of tidal marsh systems and functioning, and the restrictions the highway in its current state create in terms of all the public land, all the millions of dollars of our money that's been spent to secure the lands north of 37. So I just want to let folks know that we can't, if we just rebuild as is, then we perpetuate the problems that this infrastructure that we've inherited continues to create and to create into the future. So this is a picture of me and Malcolm Doherty at a campaign we launched a year ago called Protect Every Drop. It's a partnership of water boards, the regional water boards and the state water board with Caltrans about protecting water quality with respect to roads. And my speech at that event, I said, we need roads, we need clean water. We can have both that support each other. And Mr. Doherty liked my comments. You know, we got off to a good, on the right foot there, because you know, you look at any map, you see the blue lines and you see the red and the black lines, and they all intersect and they affect each other. You know, water can be counterproductive to roads. Roads can be counterproductive to water, but we can design them together. Now, this is interesting. You know, I'm a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and I've attended some of their symposiums since I've been on the state board, and they, at each annual meeting for the California group, they have two tracks. You know, they have the transportation track and the water track. And they, you know, I guess never the two shall mix, as in oil and water, that sort of thing. So this, in my mind, is a wonderful opportunity to really combine the disciplines in civil engineering to do a demonstration, not just for the region, but for the state, for the country, you know, for a very serious multidisciplinary project definition. So that, I wanted to just kind of kick that off. And quickly, just go over some of the issues that we have from a water resource standpoint with 37. There's water quality effect. When you have a straight line through wetlands like this, you create a barrier and it creates stagnation. You know, any given tidal cycle, you might get 1 or 2 miles of water movement. So stagnation is an important issue, and it's not just with 37. It's with transportation infrastructure around the Bay Area, including railroads. And I've studied the issue with respect to dissolved oxygen, pH swings that can lead to toxicity of ammonia when it goes up, and you get odors you all are familiar with, but methylation of mercury happens in these environments, which fixes mercury into the food chain, into the fish that we eat, toxics from the vehicles, but also when you interrupt the flow, and the circulation is the key word, circulation. It's kind of like having sepsis in your own circulatory system in the human body. The circulation of tides in these systems really cleanses and refreshes these systems. It makes them productive in fixing photosynthesis into the ecosystem energy chain. It also interrupts corridors for wildlife travel, fish travel, and it simplifies the channel system so that you don't have as much interchange and life cycle complexity. There's an issue with flooding today. You know, certainly we think of floods as affecting the highway, but also the capacity of the regional Bay Area is affected by having a barrier to flow. So it actually is a barrier to flood attenuation in sea level rise projections. So let's ask ourselves as we design 37, because it's going to fail, as we saw with whether it's the wildfires, the very tragic wildfires we just endured, or Houston, we say, well, it was the perfect storm. These perfect storms keep happening. And one thing piled on another will lead to a situation where 37 may be inoperable in the next year, let alone 50 years as projected on an average basis. On an acute basis, things could pile up to really create a problem, and we dodged a bullet this year that I'll share with you. So let's ask ourselves, what would the water do without a highway there? And I think some of you have seen presentations from Jeremy Lowe of the San Francisco Estuary Institute about what used to be there. You know, this is kind of a high area in the marsh, and it makes sense, right? You build a road on the high point. But it would periodically flood and then allow for this refreshing of adjacent systems that are now isolated and degraded. And so let's ask ourselves, how can we mimic these functions in the future design? And as I use this saying all the time as an engineer, you know, let nature do the heavy lifting. Let tidal flows do the work. Design, if there's a causeway or a bridge, design it, and we see this throughout infrastructure, throughout the country, design it to allow flows to be efficient through the structure. So quick overview. This is a map of the Bay Area, and the red on here shows the existing tidal marsh today. That is the core tidal marsh that does all those good things that I'll describe in a second. And you'll see that the extent of tidal marsh used to be the extent of where you see the blue on this map is the extent of the slough system that was historically tidal. So, you know, we have only about 5 to 10% of what we once had. But look how you can see 37 on this map. You know, see those straight lines? I guess I can see it better on this map. But it's basically, it creates a barrier to tidal flow along 8 miles on one area there of the map, and there's other areas. So this is a map from San Francisco Estuary Institute, and I want to point out this. Yeah, you think there is a target on 37. Do you see it? It's the big circle. What this map shows is the contiguous marsh. Now, when you talk about taking endangered species off the endangered species list, you know what the #1 way to do it is? Is to create contiguous, connected systems, vast areas. And so what this map tells you is on a regional level for the Bay Delta, the area around 37 has the most potential to have areas of land 5,000 acres or greater that are connected. This is the recipe, you know, the pathway for recovery of endangered species. And as an engineer, let me tell you something, who's worked in the Bay muds and the salt marshes around the Bay, I would love to see the endangered species off the list so I can do work on infrastructure near the Bay in a window outside of September to December. Okay? The economic benefits of taking these species off the list are huge. And so when we look at the potential for doing it, this part of the Bay that's cut off by 37 is one of the main opportunities. And then, you know, so we got the endangered species, but also this is where fish get bigger, so they survive in the ocean, a nursery for important species like halibut, also other sensitive species in marsh, educational values, social values, commercial fisheries, sport fisheries, but also flood control. With rising sea level, there's that one thing, but also there's an absorption capacity that these vast landscapes that are under public ownership now can give us, but they are incrementally cut off by transportation infrastructure around the Bay, and 37 is a big 8-mile long in one area, but over in Marin, there's another big barrier between Black Point and 101. There's another area between Petaluma River and Lakeville Highway. These are all areas that could be part of a flood system that helps us adapt to sea level rise, but also just deal with current flood risk. Okay, and really support the transportation agencies and others to continue this engagement of knowledgeable and interested stakeholders. You know, early on we looked at, in this process, the data, the analyses, very reputable consultants and researchers. Now, Fraser Schilling led an effort that I mentioned earlier, and he kind of divided this into 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 for a timeline as far as stakeholder processes that have occurred, and 3.0 is where we are today, and we want to encourage just providing information, and we looked at some conceptual designs. Since 2016, there's been a focus more on the existing alignment, where the 37 is currently, and more conceptual design and discussion among the elected officials. And today, we want to draw attention to the importance of tidal marshes, not just for ecosystem, but for lots of services to people. And we want to recognize that there are unknowns out there and return to a stakeholder process that had begun. So I'll go back, you know, again, we all know it's been in the news. It was a serious issue this year in terms of several weeks of not having access to this roadway. We all learned how to live without it, and it was difficult, doable, but difficult. This is an interesting slide because Fraser put this together. This shows, if you go to the bottom picture, these are pictures taken from the same location between 2013 and 2017 along Tole Lagoon, which is where 121 and 37 meet at Sears Point. It's a restoration project there. And what this shows is the creep, the slow motion creeping of the shoreline due to sea level rise in this location. And so you see that there's a roadway, an informal access roadway that's under threat now in 2017 at the top. And following the lines, you see how many feet of shoreline have eroded. It's just one example of a demonstration of climate change. And so Fraser wants to remind us that we dodged a bullet. You know, they are doing modeling to try to predict where problems will occur along 37 and other places in the Bay Area. And this is a picture here of the interchange at 101 and where there was flooding. And this is at 2 feet. It shows Novato Creek there. And then at the 100-year storm, which seems like these storms, the 100-year storms seem to happen every 10 years or so. Have you noticed this? I certainly have. This was the 36 inches and the flooding that happened at the interchange. This is the railroad that was flooded. And so let's look at some other areas. This widens out the picture where you see Petaluma River and the bridge there at Black Point. Actually, the modeling that they did showed that 2 feet of flooding at the wrong time would have flooded out that whole area between Lakeville Highway and the bridge at Petaluma River. And there was a picture of that event. And I guess what point this out is that the models actually predicted more damage in a different area than the actual damage that we observed happened. So that's, in studying the system, we can try to predict what will happen, but if the things pile up, you know, the storm surge, the king tide or the spring tide on top of a storm event, then things can pivot and move pretty quickly in the environment. They're pretty difficult to predict. So it's an interesting story that things were awful, they could have been worse. Now on the 1.0, this was a graphic that Fraser put together about all the discussion that went on. You know, we talked about a tunnel under the bay. We talked about sea level rise, and the stakeholders were engaged. We talked about public transit. As we went into 2.0, you see sea level rise kind of increased in terms of, you know, the focus. The cost seems to be getting more to an issue. The time frame is becoming more urgent. And then today, the sense is that the causeway is sort of, not as prominent. We're talking about the levee being enhanced. Congestion continues to be an issue. I don't see the tunnel on there. Earlier I saw the floating bridge idea across North Bay. That was in the previous iteration. Now that's not really being talked about. So I guess these slides are meant to convey that a lot of discussion's gone on, a lot of different options. You know, and when we talked to the Resilient by Design team about earlier this month, we really wanted to encourage to continue to think about this in a broader way, you know, and not be confined to the existing corridor, although reality may be that the existing corridor is where we need to focus due to the timeline and, you know, available, you know, it's sort of a bird in the hand when you have a right-of-way. So, you know, we respect that. But we want to encourage an open-mindedness to how we reconfigure. Even within, and we call, Fraser calls it the simplified path, which is to stay within the existing 37 corridor. Well, even then, there's a lot of information we still need to collect on depth to bedrock. What are the elevations? They are changing out there. How will we attach structures? You know, how will the engineering go for fill where we need it? And what's going on under the marshes, how fast are changes happening, and are predictive models working. So we want to call attention to the researchers at UC Davis, it's Fraser Schilling and his group, also teaming with University of Georgia and Georgia Tech. This is an area in Alameda. You may have been to the Shoreline Shopping Center in Alameda. It sort of faces the bay. It's near Crown Beach, kind of down this. And this is an area where there's 10 sites around the Bay Area, but they're looking at comparing LiDAR photos from 2004 to 2010, and on the left is 2004, and you see a migration of elevation inland. These are those white squares are buildings that are apartment buildings near the shopping center there in Alameda. So this is some of the research that they're doing in areas where roads are affected by the bay. This series of photos shows the marsh outboard from 37. I'll start in November and go through February. And an interesting observation that things are changing out there. There was more inundation, obviously from the high levels of precipitation, but the water stayed longer in the marshes this year. You may have noticed that if you're a frequent user of 37, that the inundation out in the marsh plain facing San Pablo Bay persisted much longer this summer than before. It usually would dry out. So it's very interesting dynamics going on. And so here's in November 7th. This is what we usually see when we drive by that area. And then in December, and then in January, we started seeing those first major storms. And then the next day, January 8th, that's flooded out. And January 10th, we're coming, we're basically a full tidal system all the way to 37 at this point. And in February 7th, it's receded somewhat, but it stayed connected. This is an interesting observation for those that are out there tracking this. It's a different system, and we'll see how it responds this year. A few points about armoring. That is, if you do stabilize a berm system, a levee system, the effects you have on tidal marsh, you will increase inundation in areas near the structure, increases channelization through focusing of the flows, and it increases energy in the waves. So you're dealing, kind of working against nature with more forces of the waves, and the sediment grain size increases. And so we get negative biological effects. I mentioned water quality challenges. There's also a decreased width of the zone of tidal influence and decreased time for shorebird feeding and connectivity of remaining marshes that come with an armoring approach in marshes. So as we get toward the end of my remarks, I wanted to point out from regulatory considerations and how we get from point A to point B in the regulatory process. So I really want to call attention to the Clean Water Act 404B1 guidelines, something that the Regional Water Board in this region will be responsible for implementing along with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then our California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fishery Service will be working with the Corps of Engineers. So there's at least 5 agencies involved. And these guidelines have a simple premise, and we hope, for an efficient process that these alternatives that are considered for 37 in the CEQA or the environmental review process will dovetail smoothly with the alternatives considered in the regulatory process. That's when things work best. And so there's a principle that if you can achieve the project purpose and need without filling wetlands, then you have to do that. It's required by the Clean Water Act. But if you're not able to completely avoid fill, which is understandable with many projects near the bay, then there has to be a demonstration that you've minimized the fill of the wetlands and open waters. Only then do you come up with a mitigation plan. So there is a sequence. So when we look at 37 and what's needed from a transportation standpoint, which we'll hear about later today, can that project purpose and need be achieved with a minimized wetlands footprint? This isn't just a good idea. This has to be demonstrated through this process in order to get a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and certification by the Water Board. So questions come up, let alone, if we're going to fill and widen the highway and put it on dirt and fill, where is that going to come from? Is it going to be borrow ditches? Well, borrow ditches have a history in our Bay Area of being water quality problems. They tend to stagnate and not be tidally circulated if they're an afterthought as opposed to designed in. So that's a problem. And also just the inordinate amount of fill. Now, if you do a causeway or a bridge, you're still dealing with a lot of material. You're dealing with concrete, and there's issues with having that much concrete or steel and those things. So I don't dismiss that. But this was an issue I worked on in the San Francisco Airport proposal to fill the bay that never happened. And what was really crushing for that project was the fill. You know, where was all that sand going to come from? And what kind of environmental impact would that have? So these are important issues. And then where would the mitigation happen? What if you design the project so it doesn't fill or it really minimizes fill, and then recognize that there's all these pay-forward benefits to increasing circulation and all these publicly owned wetlands that are north of 37. Director Bonham and I told this to Director Doherty back in 2013. If you design this project in a certain way, we really will work hard to make our regulatory process recognize the pay-forward benefits of increased circulation and all those things I talked about earlier that tidal marshes do for people. So this is something on our mind, that we really want to encourage circulation in this area. Sorry. And then as an engineer who's worked in the bay mud environment, this is not an easy place to build a road. You know, I do pipes and sewers and things like that, but it's hard to build infrastructure in this area. And culverts are problematic. They concentrate flows, they cause scour, and they eventually fail from just the punishing environment in an area like this. So just to say, well, we'll put a bunch of culverts in and that'll do the trick. You'll create this whole new regime of flow, concentration, and destructive flows that are unnatural if you don't do it right. I'm not saying you can't do it. It's just that we have a lot of experience with this in bay muds, in bay environments. And you want to, when you go out there and engineer something, you want to really design with nature, not against it. You know, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up for decades of fighting nature. And so we just want to look really carefully at these engineering considerations. And then I mentioned the water quality problems. So we want to encourage folks to consider alternatives that maintain this transportation and enhance the transportation function. We all agree it's a real problem out there. But it's not just the structure or the current alignment. We're not quite there yet. The decision hasn't been made. Let's focus on enhancing the overall environment, and let's recognize, you know, I really respect and appreciate the financing options that folks have looked into from a transportation standpoint, but this is bigger than transportation. This is a flood project. You know, this is getting the Bay Area ready for what Houston had to deal with, and this is part of it. This is part of bringing back endangered species and getting them off the list. This is bigger than just 37. That's why I'm here today as a state representative. And I'm excited because I think we can do it. I think we have the culture, the willpower, the know-how, the culture of working together. You know, just because transportation engineers and water engineers are in separate tracks at the ASCE conference doesn't mean we don't know how to work together, and we will in this area. We want to achieve all these multiple benefits. So I want to just mention that the economy here isn't just the road. It's a lot of other things. And this is a real opportunity to partner. And Measure AA was for wetland restoration around the bay. It's a wonderful demonstration of the public will to come up, step up to the plate and recognize the wide-ranging benefits of wetlands. And so we have the political will here to do great things. But the funds from this measure are going to be spread out around the Bay Area, not just here focused in 37. So while it might be something that can be tapped into as a diverse portfolio of financing, it's not going to win the day. It's a minor role, if any. So I want you to stare at this a little bit. I don't know if you can see it, but you know, we can preserve the structures, which we understand, you know, the need to consider that strongly. But look at the corridors around here, and look at how a North Bay bridge would work. You know, that's not over the main channel of the bay, so it would be like a San Mateo bridge, and it would be a connection up at Mare Island. It would be a shorter drive for someone from Sonoma County, getting up to Santa Rosa from the Central Valley. All those trucks, a huge amount of freight traffic that goes through 37. It would actually be a shorter run. And you could get a lot of pay-forward marsh benefits. It's interesting. It's thought-provoking. Also, you connect in it around Marin Keys over the open space lands there. Certainly, there's impacts in anything we do, but why is this off the table at this point? That's where it wasn't off the table in the stakeholder forums. So, keeping this big picture in mind of economies, communities, and ecosystems all living together. So I just want to encourage this idea of a broad project definition, that it's transportation, but it's also water resources, ecosystem restoration, and flood management on a regional scale. I strongly suggest water specialists be on the design team, and I think I really send the challenge out that it's a matter of designing with nature, which a bridge or a causeway does, versus against nature, which is what a levee or a berm does. And you're setting yourself up for a fight against nature in perpetuity, anytime you put earthen structures out in the marsh. I encourage a regional partnership. This upfront engagement of regulatory agencies is critical for a smooth process and creating a lot of momentum in the direction of a preferred alternative. I don't have my mind made up whatsoever about what that is. I know that from an engineering standpoint, certain things have to happen. A certain amount of fill is needed for this project. And so we're not going to approach this in a pin-headed, acre-for-acre way. We want to look at this as a big picture project and really get the regulatory process and the resource agencies behind this with a lot of momentum. Because I think to do something this big takes a huge amount of broad support. Meanwhile, we're going to lose that road sooner than later. And I really encourage us all to work together and think of different ways that this can solve many challenges, but create many opportunities to engage the public in the resources up there with the Bay Trail, bicycle access. There's a whole host of goals that we can achieve with this project. Thanks for getting the conversation going. I'm excited that everybody's here and interested in really thinking about this and coming up with something we can be really proud of regionally. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes before the panel is supposed to start. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Moore? Yes.
Would it
Go ahead.
be possible to go back to the slide that shows the straight line causeway and the...
No, I'm sorry.
So I completely agree with you that if we're going to spend $1 billion on something, it would be worthwhile to look at other pathways besides the existing pathway. I'm just going to pause while you get back to that. It's a long way to go. My question is, right there. Okay, so that white dotted line is what you're suggesting as a possible pathway for a causeway? And I'm wondering what that light blue line is above that. Is that an additional option, or what is?
Oh, good question. I should have said something about it. That's the existing transportation corridor along 116 and 121 and 12. So that's just the first retreat inward as far as, and that's what happened when 37 was closed, as people used that pathway as well as Richmond Bridge.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Anyone else? Here she is.
A couple of a comment and a question. There's a lot of research that is currently being done on the dam removals all across the country, and much of the stuff that you're talking about studies on the effects on the environment, the local environment, there is a lot of data already available, although who knows how much longer that data will be available with the funding problem. One of the biggest projects was the HWY River up in the Northwest. And there's a lot of information about what happens when you take out a dam and how it changes the environment. Does it return to the previous situation or not? So I encourage whoever's doing the environmental part of this study to take a look at that, because there's a lot of information already there. And which organizations or state organizations or whatever are studying the biodiversity and how it might be changed. Could you repeat that, because I missed that?
Well, good. First, yes, the HWY dam and there are other dams that have been removed in the west are being heavily studied. That's mostly an anadromous fishery benefit where salmon and steelhead have. Now, I get that. One of the main benefits that has been documented is that benefit. And so certainly we as the environmental review happens, we'll be looking at examples around the country. This is a tidal marsh setting, so there's a lot of research and data involved in those, South Bay, salt pond restoration work. So we have a wealth of information here in the Bay Area we can build on restoration. But a very good point. We're not starting from scratch. We need to build on research. As far as the research that's done, this whole area is in the San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. You're a large part of the project area on the east side. That's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages that. We have the San Francisco Estuary Institute, the maps that I showed, they do work for the consortium of municipalities doing research in the Bay Area. And so, it is catch as catch can, I will admit. It's not a comprehensive pre-project research program that's focused on the effects of this highway, but there is a wealth of research and data. And on the flood side, Napa River, the Living River Project, you may be familiar with this. It was an alternative to the U.S. Army Corps approach. It's been a wild success. It's a natural flood control project just upstream of this area. We can incorporate lessons learned about flood management and ecosystem restoration there and how it would connect up with this type of rebuilding and re-envisioning of the lower Napa River Delta.
Thank you. I have, I think, a comment more than a question that I really appreciate the broad project definition perspective of including transportation, water resources, ecosystem restoration, and regional flood management. I think that is the ideal storm of solutions that could be brought to bear in a partnership to have, as you say, a much broader effect in combating climate change. So I appreciated that very much. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that AA had a minor role. Nevada voters are being asked to approve Proposition E, which is the flood control district funding some changes. Do you envision that in advertising for this, there are all these pictures of Highway 37 floods? Is there a connection, and is that in any way a solution, or is it just a minor drop in the bucket?
No, I appreciate the question, and yes, I'm not going to start writing checks on the back of City of Novato residents, so don't worry out there. No, this is a very good question, and I think it speaks to how we're going to be successful financially. We have to cobble together available resources. One pot of money doesn't solve such a complex, multi-dimensional project as this. So, the beneficiary pays, right, for infrastructure that benefits statewide, but also locally. And so the strategy needs to be fair, needs to be equitable, and the local government representatives will look at the tools that they have in their toolbox, as far as putting up funding where there's a nexus to what the voters originally approved. And so if that nexus is there, it's fair and equitable for the local communities to have these resources to put on the table to cobble together. And that's where Measure AA, there may be a way, to make a case for a certain amount of funding from that pot. And, and so we won't predetermine this at all, but we will say we need to broaden, the participation in this project beyond something like a toll plaza. Certainly tolls are a part of it, but it's got to be, for us to be successful, we really have to have a diverse portfolio of financing. And Supervisor Arnold.
Isn't it very helpful if local government does some funding and then we're a self-help county, aren't we in a better position to gain money from the state?
It's really true. There is a leveraging that happens at the local level. And so by having these kind of measures that are self-imposed, it shows a commitment of that region or city or what have you to really participate. And yes, when as part of our funding, we look for things, we call it the match, what's the local match when we're doing sewer infrastructure investments and loans from the state level. So absolutely, Supervisor Arnold, those efforts at the local level show a willingness to participate. That is mirrored by the Measure AA. And there, so that's where I say there's a minor role probably, but we don't want to assume that would solve all the marsh restoration issues in 37.
That's it. I want to thank you so much, Mr. Moore. This has been an incredible presentation. This will be a discussion on options and obstacles regarding Highway 37, which we've just heard many of. I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself, and then we can start the panel discussion. So why don't we start with Ms. Gaffney, please.
Good morning. Is this too loud or just right?
It's good.
Okay. Maureen Gaffney. I'm with the San Francisco Bay Trail Project, and I do all things Bay Trail in the North Bay, San Francisco, Marin, Sonoma, Napa, and Solano.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Davenport. I'm a project manager at the State Coastal Conservancy. I am the coordinator of the Highway 37 Baylands group, which I'll be telling you about. And I also work on a variety of projects focused a lot in the North Bay as well as Alameda County. We provide grants to local governments and nonprofit organizations to carry out a variety of projects in the areas of habitat restoration, public access, farmland conservation, and different kinds of like river restoration, wetland restoration, and various projects like that, urban greening. And I also serve as a staff person to the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, which is responsible for providing grants under Measure AA.
Well, good morning. I'm Daryl Halls. I'm the Executive Director of the Solano Transportation Authority. We're one of the 4 county transportation authorities that are working on 37. Most of you are probably in the Marin area. I did know 50% of the corridor is actually in Solano County. Solano goes fairly far west, almost to Sears Point, so obviously part of it's in Sonoma, part of it's in Marin. And so we're one of the transportation agencies that's working with Caltrans, working with our partner counties such as NIC, trying to advance this project. So we've been spending a lot of time, as Supervisor Arnold mentioned. You're going to hear later from a couple of supervisors, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Spering. They're working very actively trying to make this a priority. Just a real quick thing before we'll have a little bit more to talk about later, but in Solano County, this was our priority corridor back in the 1990s, was 37. So how many of you have ever been to Six Flags? Maybe brought your kids? You can see that section's been elevated. It's 4 lanes. It works pretty well. It's out of the floodplain, for example. That's what Caltrans and STA worked on in the 1990s. As you can tell, this has not been a priority for any of the 4 counties probably in the last 20 years. We've all had 101, I-80, other big priorities that have been focusing our attention, and now we recognize with all the factors going on, 37 has to be a major priority.
Good morning. My name is Nick Nguyen. I'm with the Transportation Authority Marin. I'm a principal project manager for the Transportation Authority. I'm one of the staff members working with Daryl and his team, as well as Sonoma and Napa, to provide some solution packages for this corridor. And I'm glad that Daryl and I are here. We kind of bookend the corridor from Marin 101 to I-80 and Vallejo. So I'm glad that we're here talking about this issue, and hopefully we can answer questions for you guys.
Okay, looks like it's my turn. So, the San Francisco Bay Trail is a planned 500-mile trail around the entire San Francisco Bay, running through all 9 Bay Area counties and 47 cities. We have 354 miles in place today and in use, and hope to be increasing those every year, every month. This is not, where do I point this?
Here. The top of the...
Aha! And she can operate a PowerPoint. So, yeah, I was saying we have 354 miles complete, 4.5 toll bridges. That half, of course, would be the east span of the Bay Bridge. And so the Bay Trail provides public access to the Bay. The mission and goal of the Bay Trail is a fully separated, I'm not sure why it's sort of flickering like that, a fully separated multi-use path located as close to the shoreline as possible. And it connects neighborhoods, jobs, transit centers, BART stations, ferries, provides a good alternative commute corridor in a lot of places, links to park, obviously links to our shoreline. We have a board of directors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit administered by ABAG. Now with the merger, we're ABAG/MTC. There are 3.5 of us who work on the Bay Trail. We've had a grant program for many of the last 10 or 15 years. Largely, those funds are provided by the State Coastal Conservancy through the different park bonds, Prop 84, Prop 12, all those that we all voted for and should continue to vote for. So again, the key mission and goals of the Bay Trail: Class 1 multi-use pathway for cyclists and pedestrians that's fully separated from traffic, located adjacent to the shoreline, a safe and inviting recreation and alternative commute corridor that's compatible with wildlife and sensitive habitats. We have a lot of different environments that we run through. Clearly, the Bay Trail on the Embarcadero in San Francisco is a very different animal than the Bay Trail at Sears Point or at the Tubbs Tolley Loop Trail or associated with the Napa Plant Site Restoration Project up in American Canyon. So we have different, we have guidelines for the Bay Trail, but they're not, rigorous requirements. We like to see a 12-foot wide path with 2-foot shoulders paved, but that obviously doesn't make sense if it's a levee top system in a very wild, remote area. So we're flexible. And the Bay Trail in the Highway 37 corridor, it's a 21-mile corridor, as we know. There are 15 miles of Bay Trail gaps and 13.5 miles of existing. So I'm better with words than math, but even I know that doesn't add up to 21. And the reason for that is that the Bay Trail in the Highway 37 corridor is not entirely contiguous with the roadway. So we have some really great existing Bay Trail as part of the Sonoma Baylands project, and that's out on that levee, and that then connects to the recently completed Bay Trail at the Sears Point levee. And then we come back up to Highway 37. We have a gap there connecting the Sears Point to the Tubbs Tolley, which comes down to the bay there. And then our current alignment heading east is out on the Vallejo Sanitation District levee, but that's a gap for now. Then we come back up and join the Highway 37 corridor from there over to Mare Island. And this is just a map that I put together, so there may be some gaps in here, but just based on my knowledge of what the existing sort of public access opportunities are in the corridor, that any project in the Highway 37 area would need to consider and make sure that we're still providing opportunities to reach those places that we've put a lot of money and resources into already, such as the Bay Trail at Sonoma Baylands, Sears Point, the Tubbs Tolley Loop, Deer Island, Black Point, the Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters. You get the idea. The public, there's a Caltrans public viewing areas out there, the Wilson Avenue Trailhead, White Slough. So the key considerations for the Bay Trail project in the Highway 37 corridor, safety. We feel very strongly that all the options would need full, any options for a bicycle pedestrian facility would need full barrier protection and adequate buffer distance for bicycles and pedestrians. Again, just like the previous slide, connections to existing Bay Trail and other open space assets in the corridor should be maintained. And that a complete continuous, and free multi-use pathway as a baseline element of all the alternatives that move forward. A toll road is certainly one of the options on the table, and we, of course, feel strongly that the bicycle and pedestrian aspect of that should remain free. And this corridor connects actually on both sides. It's bookended by two other regional trails. On the Solano and Napa side, there's the Napa Valley Vine Trail, which is a 47-mile fully separated pathway connecting the Vallejo Ferry to Calistoga. They are making great strides on that project. It's very, very impressive. And then here on the Marin side, we have the planned SMART path, which is a 70-mile separated multi-use path running from Larkspur to Cloverdale. Wetland restoration projects are one of the great ways that the Bay Trail has seen some major progress over the last 10 or so years. When you're doing these great wetland restoration projects, and you can include the public access as part of the planning, the design, the thinking from the very beginning, you really come up with a holistic, integrated plan that provides the restoration and the opportunity for people to get out and see it and appreciate it, and then and understand why it's important to support these efforts when it comes to the ballot box or just support in general. So this is, again, the Sears Point Bay Trail, one of those examples where it was planned hand in hand from the beginning, public access and restoration. This is the Napa Plant Site wetland restoration up in American Canyon. Several miles of Bay Trail included in that. One we're all familiar with here in Marin, the Bay Trail at Hamilton Wetlands. And similarly, we work in a lot of urban environments around the Bay, and the same thing goes for these big transportation facilities. When you design the Bay Trail and the bicycle pedestrian facilities as part of the project from the get-go, you get a really good facility that's seamlessly incorporated. Bay Bridge Trail, another example that works really well. This was used by a ton of people. People loved this pathway even when it didn't go anywhere. For many years, as you probably remember, this part of the trail went almost to Yerba Buena Island, but not quite. So you just went out and came back, and people still used it. People still really loved it. And this is right next to 4 lanes of rushing traffic, and it actually works pretty well. I think the separation is important, and just it was really thoughtfully designed. So Highway 37 presents challenges and opportunities for the Bay Trail on all these fronts: meshing with the transportation facility, adapting to sea level rise, compatibility with habitat restoration, and designing a safe and inviting trail in the context of all of the above. But it's such an amazing opportunity, really, to think about scale restoration on that scale, and being able to include the design of inviting recreation into all that from the beginning. This is a slide that I'm sort of showing whenever I get the opportunity. It's sort of for inspiration, and it just reminded me of the type of landscape out here. We've got sort of a marshland, some creeks. We've got a transportation facility that shows, at least 4 lanes of vehicle movement. We have bicycles, pedestrians. We have an opportunity. It looks here like folks are getting down off of this structure and into the marsh areas. That's something that we hope might be able to be accomplished with what happens on Highway 37. Is that there's a bicycle pedestrian facilities incorporated, but there's also an opportunity to get off of that facility and down into the marshes, whether it's boardwalks, viewing platforms, and really see what it is that we're restoring down here. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank
Maureen Gaffney from the San Francisco Bay Trail Project for being here. She represents two of our panelists who are stakeholders. The other two are planners. So we wanted to get a perspective from different groups of individuals. And inside your packet, inside the Bay Area Monitor, you'll find information on marshes, ensuring a healthier bay shore. A letter from a different stakeholder, the Bicycle Coalition, wrote a letter to Highway 37 about the Highway 37 sea level rise corridor. I hope you get a chance to read that. And then you also have a map, Bay Trail map that we saw in the PowerPoint presentation. So our next stakeholder will be Jessica Davenport, who is the project manager for the San Francisco Bay Area Project, California State Water Conservancy, Coastal Conservancy.
Thank you very much. Do we have the PowerPoint available? Well, while we're waiting, I'll just say it's really great to get out in the community, and I'm really impressed with the questions we've had so far. I know you all are really engaged in these issues, and I also want to say that Vice Chair Moore's presentation was a great setup. He's covered a lot of the issues that I was going to mention, so hopefully I can stay in my time frame so I can go a little quicker. So overall, the State Route 37 Baylands Group, our mission is to promote integration of ecological and transportation planning for the North Bay. And the way we like to present that is integrate, don't mitigate. Traditionally, a lot of transportation projects have been developed first, and then the procedure is to consider the environment and figure out what environmental impacts are going to happen, and as we heard earlier, avoid, minimize, and mitigate them. But in this case, we have an opportunity to think about them all at once in a very early stage. And I do want to say thank you to the local transportation agencies and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Regional Transportation Agency, for inviting us to have this kind of more collaborative look at the whole corridor and how we can integrate this habitat planning and restoration that's already been going on for several decades. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are of the Baylands Group, the Conservancy's role, and some background on the Baylands Ecosystem Habitat Goals, as well as Flood Control 2.0 as a model for collaborative design. So as you've already been hearing, a lot of Highway 37 is at or just above sea level. It's mostly running through the historic marsh areas. Part of it was originally built on a higher wave-built berm on the area to the east of 121. However, other parts were built right through the marsh. And clearly there's marsh all around it right now. And in addition, there's so much land in this area. It's a really tribute to local stakeholders, organizations, and agencies who have really valued land conservation and restoration in this area. There's a huge amount, 30,000 acres have been protected, and a lot of habitat restoration has occurred in this area. The investment in the ecosystem not only exceeds 20 million, but we've been crunching some more numbers since I prepared this PowerPoint, and it's closer to 600 million. Including local match, as well as state and federal money. So basically, our group came together because of the flooding that happened last winter, and there was a sense of urgency. As was discussed earlier, although there's been such a long stakeholder processes and engagement, it seemed that all of a sudden things were on a fast track, and we weren't sure that all the environmental issues were still going to be considered if it did move forward super quickly. So our group came together. It consists of North Bay wetland land managers, who've been working collaboratively together for years, like the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which manages the Napa-Sonoma Marshes Complex, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the refuge. The Sonoma Land Trust actually convened our first meeting. They own a lot of land and have done great restoration, including the Sears Point project, which you saw there, but also uplands, connections to the watershed, the creeks, and how they connect into this system. And then other stakeholders with a long-term interest in this area. We have San Francisco Estuary Institute, scientists from there, Point Blue Conservation Science. Just a really, we have a bunch of nonprofits like Audubon California, Marin Audubon, Ducks Unlimited. So it's a really great broad stakeholder group. And this map shows you completed restoration projects in dark green, those that are ongoing in lighter green, and then the planned restoration in orange. So you can see it's quite an extensive amount of habitat restoration in this area. So you might be wondering, well, what's a state agency doing involved in all this work with a bunch of local partners and nonprofits, both local government and nonprofits and other individuals? Well, the Conservancy has been a long-term funder through some of those bond measures that you heard about of the Bay Trail, as well as these restoration projects. And so we were invited into this group, and we have a program called our Climate Ready program. And it so happened that the timing worked out well because we actually didn't have funding at that time for our Climate Ready program, but we had what we call a technical assistance grant. So I'm able to provide support to this group and coordination to help bring all these amazing perspectives together from the restoration and conservation community and help get those messages and coordinate with the transportation agencies and the regulatory agencies so that we can have this collaborative process. And the Conservancy also funded the Baylands Goals Science Update, which was completed in 2015. So originally there was a Baylands Ecosystem Habitat Goals report that came out in 1999, and that was really a great collaboration and a blueprint for action for restoration, and it was really helpful to funders to know that a whole bunch of scientists and managers had come together to know where we wanted to do restoration and what it could accomplish. And then as the issue of sea level rise came up and people started to say, well, you're restoring these wetlands, but aren't they all going to be underwater? We realized that we needed to come together again as a science and management community and address that issue. And so the report is actually called The Baylands and Climate Change, What We Can Do. So this is what the report looks like. If anybody wants one, we can send one to you later. But it did bring together all these scientists and managers, an agency steering committee to make sure that it was answering those management questions. But it's really science-based, and so we call it a science synthesis. It does look at the effects of climate change on the baylands, and also the important issue of sediment supply. So when you restore an area, especially if the land has subsided below sea level, you really need sediment to come in to build up the marsh plain so that you can have vegetation and have that important function of a tidal marsh. So this report looked at that issue of sediment supply, as well as the rate of sea level rise and in different areas around the bay and what the issues are going to be in order for the marshes to keep up with sea level rise. And the overall goal is to have a healthy ecosystem that is resilient to climate change for people and wildlife. And there's really a vision there and again, a blueprint taking it from the 1999 report up into 2015. And I think this was already covered really well, why we care about tidal marshes. They do help with clean water, flood control, the food web, wildlife recreation and scenery. So I won't go too far on that. But just to give you a sense, I think this Baylands Goals report does a really nice job of talking about why we need to restore complete ecosystems. I think initially people thought, okay, let's just restore a salt marsh with pickleweed for the salt marsh harvest mouse and the clapper rail. And then over time, you know, the the vision broadened beyond endangered species to look at how all these habitat mosaics can really work together to benefit a broad variety of species. And also, when we do have those high tides, those species need somewhere to go upslope so they don't drown or just get picked off by predators. And there's a real strong connection between the uplands, the marshes, and the subtidal areas, and the importance of restoring eelgrass and oyster beds has been recognized. So this is progress. And I think another key thing that this report really brings out is this idea that you have to restore processes. You can't just plop a habitat down and expect it to function. It has to be connected, especially if it's a tidal marsh. You need the tides. And then you also need those connections from the upper watershed, the sediment feeding the system. Another key point was the idea that we do expect marshes to migrate, and we have some idea of where they might go in different areas. So we have to think about strategies for migration space. How do we allow them to migrate and create connections so that they can? We do have these endangered species. I'm trying to wrap up because I'm getting close to the end of my time. But it's not only endangered species. There's a broad variety of fish and birds and mammals in these areas. We have seen in the Balance Goals report a recommendation to elevate Highway 37 to allow that full connection for water, sediment, and wildlife. We are also engaging with the planning process. There's a corridor improvement plan. A draft has been released. And there's also a focused discussion about this middle segment B, the section from Highway 121 to Mare Island. And so the Balance group has gotten engaged in this process, and we're looking forward to engaging with the transportation agencies in a process that's modeled on Flood Control 2.0, which brought together transportation engineers and wetland restoration ecologists to design something that works for both sides. So we want to do something similar with the Highway 37 corridor and bringing those experts together and being able to work through design options. And we have a comment letter as well. We can provide that to you later that looks at why we have a series of different issues that we want to raise on the environmental side for this. And just again, I want to emphasize that our main message is to integrate, don't mitigate. Thank you.
Thank you.
For a second to adjust. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jessica Davenport. Our next speaker will be Daryl Halls, Executive Director from Solano Transportation Authority. He was kind enough to bring a copy of his PowerPoint presentation, which is inside your Bay Area monitor.
So thank you very much. Let me start by noting behind you, you saw the poster boards. Those are actually from some recent public outreach meetings we've been having, so hopefully those are helpful, and we have a lot more information if people are curious. Let's see if we're ready to go here. Oh, there we go. That's a good start. Well, give you.
You can back it up.
There we go. So this is just an overview. I've been asked to do two things. One is to talk about the challenges. You've heard some of the challenges from the various stakeholder groups, which is good. Also to talk a little bit about what's the public process. And so I think Supervisor Arnold mentioned that the 4 county transportation authorities came together back in 2015 to partner together to start advancing or coming up with recommendations for 37. And so this is a quick overview. This just shows you the corridor, which you know about. Obviously, 37's got a lot of unique attractors. It's a very diverse corridor. We've heard about a lot of the environmental issues, water quality issues, et cetera. It's also got a lot of economic issues. Obviously, you've got Sears Point or Sonoma Raceway. You've got Six Flags. You've got agriculture. You've got the wine industry. You've got a lot of tourism. There's a lot of goods moving along this corridor. So there's a lot of things going on in this corridor that when a lot of different types of traffic. There's the east-west commute corridor, obviously, with folks in Solano coming to work in Marin and Sonoma, but then also during the weekend you've got events and a variety of different things that are going on this corridor. Some of the challenges, one of the key challenges, and this is something that the region's struggling with, is both the construction of available housing and also affordable housing. Solano, it's not a big secret, we are really the affordable housing solution in the Bay Area. That's where folks move to get a house that they can afford. And they live out in Solano, then they end up commuting west to places like Marin and Sonoma County. And so I think everyone sees that in the morning. And this just shows you the comparable average housing prices, and that just kind of shows what the issues are. Of course, traffic, and that's, until the flooding, I think it's fair to say what was creating the sense of urgency for the public is the fact that you've got a major impact with the economy coming back in the region, which is good. More people are going to work, which is good. But also the impacts on corridors like 37 has really gotten acute. And especially the last 3 to 5 years, we've really seen a lot of traffic impacts going on in 37. And it's not able to really handle those impacts. And we're seeing a lot of travel delay. We've heard a lot of conversation about adaptation, about a variety of issues. I think this is our recognition. We know those are important issues. We participated in the UC Davis study that Steve Moore referenced earlier. All 4 counties were participating in that. That was really the long-range planning document before our 4 counties got together. And it identified what was happening in the future and the fact that this corridor was going to be vulnerable long-term to sea level rise in specific areas in particular. Obviously, we've seen since then there's some very specific issues with flooding. So we know back in January, you're very familiar with what happened in Marin County. What you may not be aware, at the same time, Marin Interchange closed twice, almost in the exact same time it closed due to flooding, the eastbound direction. So there are vulnerabilities up and down the corridor in Marin, Sonoma, and Solano County that we're all 3 having to deal with. Caltrans stepped up to help do a little bit of a patchwork in the Marin side, about an $8 million urgency order that was done to help elevate parts of the road. Alternatives, I think you saw some suggestions on alignment alternatives. This is the existing corridor. The green is 37. And whenever 37 closes or gets impacted, the alternatives are a lot farther. They're literally double. And in most cases, they're either impacted like the Richmond Bridge, San Rafael Bridge, or they're like the 11612, where it's kind of a meandering 2-lane highway, not designed to take traffic off of 37. So the alternatives are not real viable in terms of what happens if 37 would close. And obviously, there have been some folks talking about, well, just let 37 subside. Well, it's going to significantly impact your other highway network. When we first got together, there was talk about, well, funding's been a big issue. How do you fund these things? And so this chart, it's kind of hard to read. Maybe you see it in the PowerPoint we handed out. This is under traditional funding sources. If the 4 counties got together and made this their #1 corridor for the next 50 years or 80 years, how long it would take to fund a major project on 37. I'm talking about a significant investment of a major project, which is ranging, depending upon what alternative you pick. None of them are cheap. There's no cheap option. They're in the $1 billion to $4 billion range, depending upon how dramatic you want to get. It would take about 80 years to fully fund the project, because our 4 counties are small, and by the time we collect enough state money and traditional money, again, this is saying it's the #1 priority. That means we're not doing 101. We're not doing 80. We're doing this. This is how long it's going to take us to fund the major project. And what the red lines show you is this is what the UC Davis identified is the time frame for when adaptation hits, when parts of the corridor start to go underwater. Not just get flooded, but actually go underwater. So you can see this is really a losing proposition. We can't do nothing. We can't just sit and keep talking about it. We're going to have to start making some investments, some improvements to try to preserve this corridor. So again, as Supervisor Arnold mentioned, the 4 county transportation authorities, we do work together a lot on a lot of regional issues. So this is not new for us to partner on stuff. As you're probably aware, Marin's been and Sonoma working together on the 101 Narrows. We work together with Napa on Jameson Canyon. So we have a history of working together. So we formed a partnership through an MOU where we brought our elected officials together with our staffs to start pooling resources. There's 3 elected officials from each of the counties. 3 of them are here today, Supervisors Connolly, Arnold, and Spering. But everybody has 3 reps. All 4 of our MTC reps are on there. That's intentional, so that we have good access to MTC, which plays an important role. We've also got a project leadership team, and we have an executive committee. So myself and my 3 colleagues, so most of you probably know Diane Steinhauser from TAM, and also Suzanne Smith from Sonoma and Kate Miller from Napa. The 4 of us are an executive team. Nick served with Robert Guerreros in the audience, with all of our engineering planning staff are working together. So there's a lot of collaboration going on. That's been happening for about 18 months. That's why you're starting to see some progress. STA happens to be the lead coordinating agency. As I said, half the corridor is in Solano, so we agreed to take the lead. But everybody's pitching in, everybody's playing a role, and it's very important. We've also got some critical, what I call traditional transportation partners. The first one is Caltrans, which owns and operates the highway, which means nothing happens without their concurrence. So they're obviously a very critical partner. MTC, which is the regional planning agency, they helped put most of the funding together to do the corridor study that Nick will talk about in a little bit. We're also working with BCDC and other various interest groups, and of course that's beginning to expand. There was a question about how the public process, this kind of explains how it works. I won't get into too much detail, but the policy committee formed back in December 2015. One of the first things they looked at, because there was a lot of questions about transit alternatives, what about buses or rail or ferry? So we've done some initial looks at all those. There's actually more detailed studies going on. We've been working with our transit partners, the transit operators like Marin Transit, for example, and Seoul Transit in Solano County. Solano is about to embark on a ferry study with WETA, which is the regional ferry operator. It will include TAM, hopefully, and Golden Gate, looking at what's the potential feasibility of ferry service between Marin County and Vallejo. Rail, there's been some rail study work, but probably needs to be more. My only comment about rail is rail will not be cheap because you're going to have to protect it, and it's going to be expensive to fund it, but it's something that we can look at. We've also, really the purpose of the policy committee was to have a forum for us to get together and talk and work on issues, but also to bring in various groups that would be interested. And you're seeing some of those today so that we could be coordinating on both what the corridor plan should be, what some financing options would be, what the project would be, how do we advance the project. Funding was critical. When we started this process, there was no money at all for 37. There was no planning funds. There was no project funds coming from any of the 4 counties or Caltrans. And so we started from basically zero or scratch. We got an $800,000 commitment thanks to our MTC commissioners. The 4 of them asked MTC for some planning dollars. We're doing $1 million corridor study that Nick will talk about. The 4 counties provided match funding. So that's giving us a long range, both the short range and long-term view of the corridor. These are some of the things that we've identified. We retained a private financing consultant. If you look at the last poster board, that gives you a summary overview of whether or not this is viable. And we have to look at all fund sources. There was an unsolicited private venture group came to us early on talking about, hey, we'd like to do this as a private toll road. BATA, the Bay Area Toll Authority, has been talking to us. But what we identified through that study is that, yeah, if we're willing to consider tolling, we could generate enough money to do a project. But the public's going to have to decide if that's what they want to do, and that decision has not been made yet. We also identified a number of policy questions about what we were willing to consider as a group, because again, you got 4 very diverse counties, and I think, I'm sure Nick will talk about Marin's issues, and your 2 supervisors from Solano and Marin will talk a little bit later. We developed as I said, the initial financing options, and then we started the corridor study. These are the agencies I mentioned. Caltrans has already stepped up. They did the flood repair project this past winter for $8 million. They also provided some money to do some of the public outreach that was part of 4 workshops that we did recently. MTC provided some funding to do the corridor study, the preponderance of it, about $800,000, and Nick will talk a little bit about that. Let's see if there we go. This is the corridor study. I'm going to skip over this because I'm going to let Nick handle that part. I'll take your stuff. The last thing I'll just talk about is the financing options, which some of that you can see in the back. It's very high level. It's very cursory. And it looks at this potentially as being an eighth bridge, because if you look at the corridor, it almost operates like a bridge, like the Bay Area bridges. Also as a corridor. And also looked at there's also different private financing options, combining public and private. Other states do a lot more private financing of their facilities than California does. But this, we think, is a good model for both public investment and private investment, and some combination of both may end up being the solution. So we do have some initial information on that. So that's just kind of gives you 2 examples of one would be a toll corridor, the other could be a toll bridge. This is where we're at in the process, very early in the process. We're not in environmental yet. The corridor study is going to help define some of that stuff. There's a lot of opportunity for public engagement. In fact, we're looking for public comments as we speak. I've been told to stop, so I'm about to stop because I listen to my traffic signs, being a traffic guy. So anyway, there's good opportunities, so please talk to Nick or Robert after the meeting. We just did 4 public workshops, and we are still looking to get comments before we get into the environmental document, hopefully next year.
Thank you, Daryl Halls from Solano Transportation Authority. Next, we have Nick Nguyen, who is the Principal Project Delivery Manager from Transportation Authority of Marin, to talk to us about the 3 design alternatives.
I just want to thank Vita and the League of Women Voters for actually preparing, actually hosting this event, and for framing the discussion really well. You invited some great speakers and from all walks of life, if you will. Mr. Moore had a great framing of the water quality issues. Maureen had a great framing of multimodal access, bike and pedestrian particularly. And Jessica did a great presentation on kind of the ecological, environmental issues and opportunities. And then Daryl did a great job of framing what the local and regional push and framing of the discussion at the local level. So thank you for that. And so my role today is just to present to you some initial results from the transportation analysis that we've done so far.
Could I just make a couple comments?
Yeah, thank you.
The other thing I wanted to mention, if you're interested in this subject,
Click on insert.
the 37
That's
policy
what it
committees are
says.
public meetings, and they're about every 2 months, and we have usually about 100 people there. You can hear all the discussion in live, and so you get see all the elected officials. You can write comments. So just check with Nick or Robert after the meeting, and we'll put you on the contact list because the group's been kind of growing, and it's good. And all the various agencies show up, I think, and discuss. But the public's definitely welcome. So
Yeah. Well, you know what you could do? Wait. Do,
website.
no.
Yep.
So
All 4 TAs have it on their website for information, a lot of the reports, et cetera.
and just drag.
We haven't summarized it yet because we just had the workshops. We're going to be presenting those in about a month or 2. But I think we're getting a lot of comments about, the transportation problem, the flooding problem, a lot of the issues you're seeing here. Incorporate, the ecology into with it. So I think we're getting, some folks are focused on very specific, like I want you to look at transit or rail or public access. So a lot of the comments you're seeing in these presentations that we're getting a lot from the public. But I also think there's a sense of urgency. People want stuff to happen now and not wait 20 years. So I think we're hearing a sense of urgency. Sure.
I will take some questions now. Anybody else have? Okay.
In terms of the folks who are living in Solano and who are commuting into Marin and Sonoma, I was curious if you have data on which cities in the county they're coming from and what kinds of jobs they're commuting to the west?
Yeah, well, they're coming from Vallejo, Fairfield, but the whole county, Vallejo and Fairfield primarily, but they're, Vacaville, the whole county. I think they're going to a whole range of jobs. I mean, these are kind of again, they're living in a more affordable county, and these are service jobs and management jobs, probably the whole spectrum. Some of them could be retail, but it's quite a range. But they're definitely coming from Vallejo, Fairfield, Vacaville area. Yeah, quite a bit.
We do have, if we can get my slides up, we do have an origin. We do have an origin and destination studies that are being conducted. We do have some initial information, so I hope to present to you some initial information from which counties people are coming and going from. Not particularly what job centers particularly, but we do have county information.
You just answered one of my questions, is that I believe it was Tam that did a very elegant study about origin destination along the 101 corridor. And I was wondering if something is comparably available for the 37 commute. And likewise, on the poster spec here, it mentioned that the eastbound congestion was much greater than the westbound congestion. And I was wondering why.
Well, I think there's some operational issues that present themselves in the eastbound direction, and then I think part of it is some traffic and some traffic patterns that occur in the afternoon that are different than obviously in the mornings. There are some issues with people perhaps taking 101 home and then cutting over on 37, increasingly more. in the afternoons as opposed to in the morning. And then we do have an issue of the bottleneck that occurs at Highway 121. There's a couple of traffic signals, obviously 116 and as well as 121. There's some lane drops at 121, just at the railroad tracks that constricts the movement a little bit more as well. So but the important thing is that we're going to study a lot more the traffic conditions and model the traffic conditions as part of our MTC funded study. So we'll learn a lot more soon enough.
Hi, a question for Mr. Halls. Given that this runs right through a national wildlife refuge, I'm wondering if there's any possibility of federal funding and also state funding.
Well, I think,
And also, if I may add, if the wildlife refuge management is involved in this process at all.
Sure. Well, I think a couple things. The good news in California is Senate Bill 1 passed this year. So California, which has been struggling with transportation funds, now will have funds. So hopefully it doesn't get repealed, but that's restoring the state transportation improvement program. There are competitive categories. 37 could be eligible. I think somebody mentioned, I think again it was Supervisor Arnold mentioned, Regional Measure 3, the bridge toll will be on the ballot probably next year, either in June or November. That actually has $100 million for this corridor. What's interesting is the 4 counties asked for $30 million to get environmental going. Thanks to our policy folks and our state legislators, it grew to $100 million, which is very rare where you get more than you ask for, which is a good sign. There's a lot of interest. Could there be federal dollars potentially? And I think, again, with the various resource agencies, depending upon how this corridor is planned and designed, there could be other resources. And Steve could probably talk more about those. But there are, if the corridor is planning to do certain things, there may be water bond funds. There could be park bond funds. Maureen's talked about. She's got a little bit of funding that she can do some trail work with, and we've done that partnered with her. So, depending upon what the project looks like, it opens up opportunities. But I think the good news, as I mentioned, is we started with 0, and 18 months later, we've got a corridor study. Actually, my agency just last week programmed $5 million for the environmental document. So we became the first investor in the environmental document out of our STIP share, which means we're taking money from other projects to do this project. So that's kind of new for us. And then if the voters pass the bridge toll bill, then there's $100 million. Well, that would fund environmental, would do a lot of corridor work, a lot of protection work, could really do a lot of positive things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Sure.
Thanks, Mr. Halls. This is Steve Moore. Along these lines, I'm curious because you mentioned the public-private partnership that you're looking at, and that other states do that a little more than California. One of the beneficiary pays ideas here is the freight moving corridor as one example of economic benefit. And I was wondering if you have any insight into making partnerships with those type of road users and what potential.
I think that's potential. We're not precluding anything right now. What we did is with the consultant, what they did is they looked around the country and did 6 case studies of corridors that they thought were somewhat similar to 37. And I think 37 even has uniqueness as other corridors don't have with all the issues you guys have been citing. But what we wanted to keep on the table is, look, we got to fund this thing. Whatever we end up designing and planning and that we want to move forward, we've got to come up with funding. And when we first started the process, SB 1 hadn't passed, which means the state was not much of a vibrant funding partner. As you know, they were just kind of reacting to operational things through the shop, and that's it. Now there's an opportunity to get more significant dollars. There's going to be dollars every year that could be available for projects like this. Once we get it kind of ready to go and shovel ready, and we get consensus on what the project is, then I think the opportunity to fund it is going to grow. And I think the private sector could play a role. Another option that the Bay Area has that others don't have is we do have the Bay Area Toll Authority, where we've got a public agency, MTC, that the 4 counties are part of. They have funded improvements to bridges, which have a nexus, and again, that's another opportunity. So there's different opportunities that we want to keep on the table, and once we figure out what the project is, then we can start trying to finance it.
My slides were actually kind of overlap some of the discussion items that the various speakers have spoken about already. From the current body of research and study that we currently have. Highway 37 essentially is segmented in 3 different ways, segment A, B, and C. Segment A is really the Marin side with some Sonoma County. Segment B is Sonoma County and the majority of Solano, and then segment C, which has been improved in the early mid-80s, is over in Solano County, Vallejo area. From a transportation analysis perspective, we tend to look at various characteristics beforehand. So essentially, the corridor is 21 miles long. It connects Highway 80 to Highway 101 on the Marin County side. It connects not only those 2 cities and counties, but it also connects economic and commercial zones. It connects housing centers. It connects jobs. It connects motorists to recreational areas up in Marin County, Sonoma, as well as Lake Tahoe area, for example. And currently, the volume, the vehicle volumes on the corridor ranges between 40,000 and 95,000 vehicles per day, depending on which segment you're looking at. It also, with the current economic growth that we're experiencing, it promises to get higher, and congestion will also increase. The corridor passes through sensitive area, marshland area, things that Jessica has spoken about. And then that's things that Mr. Morse spoke about is its vulnerability to sea level rise. And then finally, it does serve as a major recovery route for the North Bay in case of emergency. So it does have some key characteristics. Some of the other characteristics, as a gentleman in the audience had mentioned, or asked about, was where are people coming and going along this corridor? Here's a pie chart of the trip origins of Highway 37. And as you can see, 32% of the trips originate from Solano County, 14% originates from Marin, and 18% originates in Sonoma County. If you add the Marin and Sonoma elements together, you get about 32%. So about 50-50 in terms of where it connects and touches down. Where are people going in terms of on a county basis? They're going to Solano, 37%, and 12% to Marin, and 17% to Sonoma. We don't have the granularity that the audience members spoke about in terms of job centers and whatnot, but we hope to get that, and that is something that we are striving for. So the three key challenges that the corridor faces right now is congestion, flooding, and sea level rise. And so probably, arguably, the most important one is congestion at the moment. We're seeing right now through actual studies a 6-hour congestion during the weekday AM commute, a 7-hour of congestion during the weekday PM commute. So congestion is defined as essentially the amount of time you spend driving 35 miles an hour or less. And then there's also congestion on the weekends, and there's no transit service at the moment. But during peak times, during peak hours, or during peak commute times, we're seeing about 100 minutes of delay during the eastbound PM commute, and roughly 47 minutes of delay during the AM westbound commute. So those are really big numbers as compared to their free flow conditions, which are probably half to a third of that amount. The second probably pressing challenge that we're facing with the corridor is essentially flooding. Several of us have spoken about this past January and February, where the highway was closed for close to 3 weeks. Novato Creek did overtop through some levee breaches and whatnot, saturation of the grounds. King tides were a big component of that flooding as well. And so, and at Tubbs Island, and then as Daryl mentioned over at Mare Island, the off-ramp at the interchange at Mare Island flooded several times as well. So some big issues that are certainly a component of sea level rise, but just current king tides, saturated ground conditions, and storm events. And finally, the long-term challenge that faces us all is the sea level rise issue. The modelers, the scientific modelers, have projected that by year 2050, segment A and segment B, the majority of those segments would be inundated. And then in year 2100, most of the corridor would be underwater. So what have we done about it? We formed a partnership, a policy committee in 2015 that Daryl has spoken about, comprised of the 4 North Bay counties, Sonoma, Solano, Napa, and Marin. And our task is really to help define what the solution packages are and perhaps prepare funding packages as well in concert with state and federal and other agencies. The framework, the sequential framework that the current study is taking is shown to you in front of you. We've looked at options of how to retreat from the issue if we can. We've come up with the conclusion that we can't just retreat from the problem. We have to protect and accommodate for the problems. So protecting means how do we address the issues now with some short-term solutions, levee improvements, for example, and then finally, how do we accommodate for the ultimate solution? And that may mean raising the road or some other more complex solution package. We came up with the core vision for State Route 37, which really includes all of the speakers before me, all of the things that they've mentioned. So raising the roadbed for resiliency to accommodate sea level rise, integrate the ecological opportunities that Jessica brought up. How do we improve the environment out there while we're addressing the transportation needs? And then we know that there's a bottleneck over at segment B, which is the Solano County, where it's just a 2-lane highway, 1 lane going westbound, 1 lane going eastbound. So we have to improve that capacity. So how do we do that? Do we increase it by 1 lane? Do we increase it by 2 lanes and have 2 lanes in each direction type of thing? And then finally, integrating multimodal transportation, not only some of the things that Maureen spoke about on bike and pedestrian traffic, but also transit and potentially rail and water transit as well. So we're looking at a whole myriad of opportunities here. And the important thing that I want to speak about is that we're looking at an integrated approach towards this solution. So some of the short-term solutions, possible solutions to this corridor is essentially flood protection in segment A, where we currently saw flooding in February and January. So how do we improve the levee system that actually acts as a protector of that segment? Funny enough, those levees were not built to protect State Route 37. They were built by farmers and whatnot to protect their own lands. But it actually serves as a protector for Highway 37. But we don't have controls over those levees. So how do we integrate that approach to protecting the roads by protecting the levees and armoring the levees at for the short term? And segment B, there's operational improvement opportunities that exist. For example, the bottleneck at 121 Sears Point. There's traffic signals there. There's various traffic movements, and there's lane drops and all that stuff. How do we unbottle that? And then in segment C, there's the interchange and bottleneck over at Mare Island. But what we're all here about is to look at the ultimate solution. So the ultimate solution in the long term is hopefully to raise the road. We looked at several ways of doing that. Do we raise the road by just building a larger levee that the road sits on top of? Do we build a causeway that is really comprised of a multiple pier system, shorter spans, more footprint in the ground? And then finally, a bridge causeway solution, which is really a larger, longer span, less environmental impacts because it touches down less on the ground. So the ultimate solution may cost us up to 4.6 billion. And so that would raise the road entirely off the current ground. And then ultimately, in between, there might be something that is a combination of bridge, causeway, and berm, and then somehow building that together to have multiple benefits for all the stakeholders. Next steps, we want to finish the study. Ongoing is public outreach that Daryl spoke about, and then to complete the study in the spring of 2018. And then on an ongoing process, working with all stakeholders, federal and state agencies, is to identify near-term projects and funding opportunities. And with that, I'll open up to questions and answers.
Thank you. All right, do we have questions? Any more questions? You got it, yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Olivia Beltran, and my question is, are you, within all the process and planning that you're doing, are you considering alternative energy, to be implemented within the methods? I'm just thinking about the airport has an air transportation that keeps on running on circular mode. Would it be a possibility to integrate something such as that, within the, I love the idea of the racing it all the way to a bridge, and then it would be ideal to have a railroad in it, but thinking of alternative energy, that would be fantastic, and I wonder if you're considering that concept.
That's an interesting concept. We certainly have, some team members have brought up how to clean the air up with some new technologies in materials, for example. So as we build a solution, there'll be solutions, materials built into those solutions that would clean the air, clean the water. But in terms of actually generating electricity or generating energy, that is certainly something that I'll write down right now and we can look at.
Hi, Beck. Looking at your last slide there, it looks as if the plans are kind of settling into staying in the existing road bed. And I'm just hoping, actually, that in the options that would come out in this report, that a straight line causeway from Novato to Vallejo is still on the table.
Well, maybe I can speak. We haven't precluded any alternative at this point. It's too early. So again, if that's something that the policy folks and the public want to request, that's an option. So what this is trying to frame is what are some near-term things we can be doing. I think you see a list on one of the poster boards about some very interim 1 to 2 or 3 years. So we have to wait 10 years for this. There's some midterm opportunities, and then there's a long-range vision. I think what you're talking about would be a long-range vision concept, and nothing's been precluded at this point. But I think the focus has been in the current alignment, in terms of near-term and midterm stuff. But I think, like I said, there's opportunity to weigh in. But nothing financially or alternatives other than to do nothing, which I think Nick alluded to. We've eliminated that option, to do nothing. But we don't have any ultimate decision on what the ultimate concept would be.
Any other question? Yes.
So the emergency work that was done in segment A over the last winter, how much of a solution was that? How much time did that buy us? And is that really just a super temporary thing, or did that sort of solve a lot of the issues in segment A?
Well, I think in Caltrans' perspective, it has solved the immediate needs for segment A for the foreseeable future. But they do recognize that an ultimate solution needs to be drafted and prepared.
Any other questions? Okay, yes.
Thank you. Just to follow up on your last comment, sir, to be clear, did you mean that we're okay for a while? Does that mean that if we have a similar rain pattern as we did this year, that roadway would not flood?
I can't speak for Caltrans, but because we certainly have had long discussions with them about that. They do believe that the flooding that occurred at Sonoma, at Novato Creek, excuse me, was a result of levee breaches, and so that was the systemic structural issue. There was a levee breach that breached on a private property, and that then flooded the highway. So they've addressed the levee breach. They have addressed the highways with actually putting in sheet pile walls. So even if the private property breached again, that it will not flood the freeway, the highway at that particular point. That's not to say that something else may not occur during the next storms or storm events of the future, foreseeable future. So there's no guarantees in life, is what they're telling me. But they believe that they've addressed the issues at Novato Creek.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you again. This was a wonderful panel. And our final conversation will be with two county supervisors, one from Solano, Mr. Spering, and Mr. Connolly from Marin. Please introduce yourselves and feel free to begin.
Okay, I'm Solano County Supervisor Jim Spering. I serve on the Solano County Transportation Authority. I'm the chair this year, and I also serve on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, MTC.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damon Connolly, Marin County Supervisor representing District 1, which is based in San Rafael. I'm Marin's Metropolitan Transportation Commissioner and serve with Commissioner Spering on that body, and also part of the State Route 37 Policy Steering Committee.
So I guess we can go two ways. We can have your thoughts on the issues that we've had today, which I think is what really we'd like to hear from members of the Transport MTC, and then we'll take some questions for you.
All right. Well, first I just want to compliment the League of Women's Voters and Vita for putting this together. I think the sequence is very well structured. I think Steve Moore's comments, he really put the framework in how we need to move forward working together. As you look at, you heard from Maureen and you heard from Jessica, and there's many other special interest groups that are very interested in this project. And about 4 years ago, our county has decided that this is going to be a high priority. For me, I've been talking about this project this is the 28th year, when we did all the work that we did in the Solano County portions from Mare Island to 80. There was years of work on getting that project both planned, developed, and actually put in place. And so it's not a new project, I think, as all the speakers have talked about. The approach that we finally have realized that this is not a transportation highway project. I think as Steve Moore really framed it well. This is a collaboration of a lot of interest that can do a great thing in the North Bay. In the MTC region, when you ask why is the Bay Area such a unique place, and the reason it's such a unique place is we have 9 very unique counties. You look at Solano County with our agriculture open space, you look at Marin with its agriculture open space, Napa with the wine industry, and Sonoma. All 4 of those counties have very unique characteristics, and we have a responsibility to preserve those characteristics. And for me, the transportation system helps us prevent putting growth where we really don't want it. And this project is one of those projects. And I really believe that if there was a total failure of this transportation infrastructure, it forces growth in Marin and Sonoma and various places where we really don't want it. And so it's an opportunity. The other piece to this project is I don't know of anywhere else in California, or probably most of the country, where you can really do a transportation facility that enhances the environment. The ecological benefits are just tremendous. It could be an example that can be used throughout this nation, and it's an opportunity that shouldn't be squandered. As previous speakers had talked about, you know, Damon and I both worked real hard to get that money in RM3. So if we get the bridge toll money, that measure passed, you know, there's $100 million to really start looking at this project and how do we resolve it. And, our Transportation Authority, we have taken a little different approach than what we have in other transportation projects, where usually you design the transportation facility and you say, okay, now how do we mitigate for it? Well, the approach we're taking on this project is we're bringing all of these special interest groups together, and we're finding out what do they want to see in this corridor, and then the transportation facility needs to be designed around those conditions. And that's the approach we're taking. You know, I'm for one, if you ask me, do I like the alignment that we have, the answer is yes. And the reason I like the alignment, because when we put in the pedestrian and the bicycle, the trails, all of those enhancements that really give the public access to that part of the environment of these counties, I think it's a tremendous feature that really is something that should be developed and promoted. As we were driving over, we were talking about the bird watchers that are in that whole corridor. I mean, it's just an incredible, but with terrible access. And so there's so many things that we can do to really enhance that corridor and make it a very unique feature and an iconic feature for the 4 North Bay counties. And so it's more than just a road project. And the last thing I want to say, and then I'll turn it over to Supervisor Connolly, is that, you know, as we bring all these interest parties together, everybody has a unique role to play. And it can't be at one interest expense. We all have to work together. We all have to bring resources to the table to help make this project happen. Because I think that everybody benefits from this project. And so the approach we're taking is, you know, let's look at all these environmental, ecological enhancements in the front end and then design the transportation infrastructure to help facilitate and meet those really desired goals and what we'd like to see in this region. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague.
No, I think that was very well put, and let me just start also by thanking the League and all of you for coming today, and maybe just kind of summarizing some of the things we've heard, re-emphasizing what I feel are some of the key points, and hopefully not repeating ourselves too much. Beginning with that this is truly a regional partnership, that it's a key issue for all counties involved, Marin, Napa, Sonoma, and Solano, and that we really are pursuing it as a corridor-wide project. I also want to emphasize, and you've already heard it, the current proposals under consideration are very preliminary. No decisions have been made. We're looking for all ideas and input, and again, that's why this type of gathering is so important. And we know the stakes at issue. We're seeing them already. This past winter, Caltrans invested $6 million to do an interim fix for the flooded portion of Route 37 after last winter's storms. As Marin's MTC commissioner, was very happy to see that MTC stepped up and provided $1 million to study the corridor. That study is ongoing. You're seeing some of the storyboards in the back that resulted from that study, and would love your reaction to those as we go about looking at some various possible solutions. And again, to set the context, Highway 37 corridor now serves 40,000 car trips per day, including commuters who are coming from the East Bay and North Bay and working in Marin County. I don't think it's an understatement to say that Highway 37 serves as a lifeline for our employment opportunities in Marin County. So I think as we look at solutions, we have to look at it also from the context of equity and what is best for some of those commuters. So when we're talking about things like a toll, what is going to be the financial impact of that on people using the road to get to and from work? Ultimately, and again, as we've heard, this will be a long and expensive project. It's important to keep our overarching goals in mind. To me, those are safety, improved access, congestion relief, adaptation and resilience, and that includes marsh and ecosystem restoration. So let me quickly comment on the short-term and long-term improvements to Highway 37 that are under consideration as a framework for the discussion. So in the short term, flood protection, express bus service, park and ride lots, and changeable message signs are some of the issues we're looking at. And then in the long term, as we've heard, levee improvements, highway widening, and raised roadways, and really pursuing this as a multi-benefit project. I think Jim, again, put it well, and I think Stephen Moore really summed it up. This is not simply a transportation project. We're going to be pursuing a multi-objective approach. Funding, and you heard about this as well, Regional Measure 3, which is now in play and will be coming before the voters next year. This is the proposal to raise the state-owned bridge tolls up to $3. MTC is in the mix on that. If passed by the voters, most likely in June 2018 is when that will be coming. Regional Measure 3 would provide $100 million towards Highway 37, as a measure has been proposed. As you've heard, this would by no means provide a full and final funding solution to this issue, but we're viewing it as an important down payment toward the work that would need to be done. So again, thank you for taking the time to come out. Again, this is just the beginning in many ways of a long process, and would be happy to answer any questions.
Let's do that, yes.
The league is supposed to be non-political. However, I'm going to ask a political question. You both obviously have a big, strong resolve to see this through to the end. How about your constituents? What kind of feedback are you getting from them about their resolve?
You know, I can just speak for Solano County. You know, I represent a second generation that has been dealing with this road. You know, before we had the barrier put in, you are all familiar with the deaths that were taking place on that road, just tragic. And, you know, many of us worked real hard to get the barrier in, and various operational improvements in that corridor. You know, my residents in Vallejo and the Fairfield area, they're just insisting that we do something with this road. I mean, it's not a matter of, wow, you know, let's find an alternative route or something. They want something done now, and they want it done today. You know, we've got families that are losing, you know, anywhere from 2 to 5 hours a day not being with their families or sitting in that commute. And it's not, and what's happening in that corridor isn't helping the environment. And the feedback I'm getting, I really have not heard anybody say, don't improve this road. You're getting a little concern about the toll. And one of the things that we're looking at is, you know, we have disadvantaged low and moderate income people, that this will be a struggle, and we're looking at strategies as how do we deal with that. And the one beauty of the fast track and the way we charge the tolls now is we can make those adjustments for people and people that qualify. And but all in all, the feedback that I'm getting in Solano County has been very positive of what our transportation authority is doing. Damon?
Yeah, no, very similar. You know, I think Marin County recognizes the importance of this road, but people are raising questions about should it be a toll road, and also about, you know, should we again be called upon to provide additional funding? It's legitimate issues right now. I think again it was put best. it's not going to be any one funding solution. Measure AA, I think Marin County stepped up big on that. It passed with over 70% of the vote. That's recognized as a way to attract regional money toward restoration projects. But that alone is not going to do it either. So you have Measure E locally now, which is attracting strong feelings on both sides right now. So I think it's the overall political climate we're in right now. And I think justifiably, taxpayers are looking to us to make the case. How do the funding sources fit in? Why is this road important? Again, from Marin County's standpoint, it's not just that Marin County drivers use a road, but it also is our workforce that is using this road as well.
I have a question about moving forward. What is transparency going to look like? Who's going to make the final decision about how this money is spent and what direction we're going?
Well, I wish I knew what money you were talking about. If you look at the number of public meetings that we've held and the ones that we have planned, this is a very transparent process, and everybody has been invited into the tent on this one. In our county, we actually formed an environmental committee that is made up of many of these groups that are very interested in what's going to happen in this corridor, and so we're addressing a lot of those issues in the front end. The other thing that we are doing is we're holding the public hearings. As Daryl had mentioned earlier, we've had like 4 or 5 of them just recently, these open houses where we're really trying to take input to really find out what are the demands that people are placing in this corridor. And so I think it's been a very transparent, we've spent a lot of time talking about it. We now have to start putting together a framework to how we can move forward. It's like a lot of these transportation projects. You can talk about them for 20, 30 years, but we're at the point now where we really have to start doing some planning as to how we can start moving the project forward and doing both these ecological, environmental, public access projects. How do we actually bring them to fruition? And so we're at that point where we're actually starting to talk about real concrete objectives that we can move forward.
Yeah, and my sense is the right people and groups are now fully engaged in the process. We're also holding town halls around Marin, and I think creative issues are coming up. One that I'm now kind of dialed into that I hadn't been thinking about originally is rail across the corridor. I think that is a very interesting concept and how that ties into the objectives we might try to accomplish here.
Now, don't forget all the tough questions for Damon.
No, I'm just going to backtrack a little bit about the transparency and about the public involvement. And the format of today's meeting has really been helpful. And in inviting interaction, I attended the Marin open house, and it was a dud. There were maybe 5, 10 people from the public there. There was no presentation. There was no, yes, you could ask the person standing next to a display board something, but there was no, in fact, at that point, the staff report or the plan had not been made public. And so I found that kind of a presentation, although, yeah, you could say we had X number of open houses, I don't find them very productive or helpful as a member of the public of getting a good feeling as to what the issues are and what the questions are that we have for you. So if you put on some meetings like this where you're providing some information and the public can ask important, lively questions that are important for that period of time, it would be so much more helpful than the open houses with your display boards.
Yeah, and I can tackle that. I agree with you. I think it's not enough just to have one type of conversation. The open houses serve a purpose. I think these kind of meetings do as well. As I mentioned, Jim and I both serve on the policy steering committee for this corridor project, and they're all public. They're all recorded. We're hearing about it individually from constituents as well. So I think it's going to be important to communicate in a number of different ways, but thanks for that feedback.
Yeah, and I agree with your criticism, and that's why I was complimenting this format. I think the way, have Steve Moore kick it off, this is a great progression. And the workshop we're going to have in Solano County is going to be this type of format. We're going to have it where, it's going to be open. We're going to have speakers. The public can interact with the special interest groups and really, hone down a little bit more on these issues. And so, but valid criticism and something that we will certainly take into consideration. But I do want to say that our open house in Solano County, we had a heck of a lot of people, a lot of questions, a lot of interaction. And from my perspective, a very successful public meeting there. But this format, I agree, needs to be promoted more.
I think the press is covering the issue well so far, so we're in constant contact with them as well.
I have a question. First, thank you. I mean, we've covered a lot of the environmental issues and just, the issues for everyday life here. And I appreciate that. One thing that I haven't, it was on one of the slides in the handout, but we haven't really, it hasn't come up much, is just part of the problem, not the environmental problem, well, yeah, part of that, is having more balanced communities where the majority of our workforce doesn't have to commute from Vacaville or, Sacramento. I meet people here that work here in the Bay Area, in Marin County, that commuted from Dixon that day. It's just kind of, isn't that part of the problem that we're not looking at?
Well, I don't know that this road's going to look at that, but if you look at what's going on in the region, MTC now is starting to look at how do you tie housing production to transportation funding. But I don't know that I fully buy into that, because there's places that I don't want this urban sprawl or just because we have to build houses. I have a lot of people that live in Solano County. They want to live there. They don't want to live in Marin. They don't want to live in Sonoma, but they have a good job over here. They want to travel over here. And that's why I'm saying the transportation facility has to help that movement. And it's not just commuters. This is an east-west economic corridor. We're moving goods and services in this corridor, and it's being constrained because of this facility. But your point is well taken. The communities, the cities are all being looked at now as to their housing production, job housing balance. Those things are all coming to the forefront because there's a tremendous pressure because of the lack of housing in the Bay Area. And so, but I don't know that this project is going to solve that problem. And, we always have a tendency to have a reason why we don't do something. This is a project that needs to go forward because there's a lot of people that are suffering in this corridor that are going to continue to suffer, and there will be a third generation that's dealing with this problem. And so, but your issue about housing is a very important one, and Damon will probably comment. He and I both have been discussing this issue for the past week on another issue on some of the funding, so very good point.
Housing's a key issue. It's probably one of our top priorities on the Marin Board of Supervisors as well, but so is regional transportation, and that issue is not unique to Highway 37 right now. The Richmond-San Rafael Bridge is also extremely congested right now, so we're looking at adding a third lane to that, which should come on board by the end of this calendar year, hopefully, or shortly thereafter. Looking at a direct connector between 101 and 580 to also solve some congestion issues. So following up on what Jim said, I, as our MTC representative, have been hesitant to say, yeah, we ought to condition transportation funding on housing. Both are huge issues right now for our local communities. I feel we're stepping up to look at some Marin-based solutions to the housing issue. But the fact of the matter is we have significant congestion on our roads right now, and I think we need to step up and provide funding and solutions for that. So I'm looking at Highway 37 from that lens.
Thank you. I have a question for Supervisor Connolly that doesn't require an answer right now necessarily, but something to think about. The county has initiated the Drawdown Marin program that is still in the early planning stages, but there are several components to it, including transportation and, of course, climate change and sea level rise. And several of us here today are members of an environmental organization, as many others. And so I guess the question is, could this type of workshop be a good program to advance the Drawdown Marin Forum, and how could we might be of assistance in perhaps replicating this type of community education event? And again, I know that planning is in the early stages, but just something else perhaps to think about and that we may be able to assist with.
So great question, and I can answer it right now, at least preliminarily, and then let's continue to have the conversation. So Drawdown Marin, for those who don't know, is a initiative that we launched recently that really is jump-starting implementation of our climate action plan as a county. So we had about 300 folks show up. Drawdown is a term based on the book by Paul Hawken, which I would recommend to everyone. And the idea is to go beyond simply mitigating the effects of climate change to actually reversing global warming, drawing down on our carbon. So going forward, the plan right now is to have 5 follow-up public forums on various topics coming out of that initial meeting, and one of them will be transportation. So yes, hopefully we can have something like this, but perhaps even have a couple hundred people at as well.
Thank you for mentioning rail, Supervisor Connolly. I appreciate that. Those tracks do exist, and anybody who's ridden SMART can see where those tracks head off eastward and could be revived. I'm not hearing anything about SMART being at the table. So I hope that they are being included in some of these planning efforts. In the very short term, could there not be some bus service put into place to relieve the congestion on 37? And I know that this gets difficult when you're crossing county lines from Solano to Marin, and would it be Solano's, or would it SCTA, or would it be Marin County Transit or Golden Gate? But is that not a solution that could be put in place, in 6 months?
Yeah, that's part of the short-term solutions. Yeah, we're looking at that, how we can facilitate that, absolutely. The bus is a very strong option because the bus can take people right where they want to go. The rail is very difficult, but the bus can definitely help meet that short-term need. Yes.
Yeah, it's being looked at.
It is.
Just quick clarification. I had been told, I'd been under the impression that Regional Measure 3 was targeted for November, but you said it June?
June 2018, yes.
That's locked in?
It's not locked in, but if I had to guess.
Right.
Hi, Olivia is my name, and I just want to encourage the two of you of leadership to start interweaving transportation with housing, And a way I see it, like the San Rafael School District is working about looking into housing for teachers and people like that. So I think it's important with transportation, interweaving housing for at least people that work in the field of constructing roads or something that goes along the lines of transportation. I feel right now with the lack of housing in all the Bay Area, it's very important that each of us take a role in making sure that housing is considered at every point. I think it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that housing is available to everyone. And again, in this situation, thinking about transportation, you can think about drivers that can get housing. Maybe at the end points of the bridge, there could be housing, implemented for a specific people that work within a specific fields, if that could be transportation. But I feel that we're at an era and time that we got to change our thinking. So you as leaders, I think it's important that you start thinking about innovative ways to implement and make sure that housing is considered for transportation, people that work in the transportation field.
I have a question for you. I'm very interested to how the South Bay and North Bay regions work. We have so many more people in the South Bay, much more of the funding from Metropolitan Transportation Commission is going towards the South Bay. How do we fit in the piece of the greater Bay Area? Can you speak to us a little bit about that and bringing money to the North Bay?
That's kind of a softball for me and Jim, because we talk about that all the time and how to actually overcome that very issue. And interestingly, I'm pretty new to MTC. Jim is a grizzled veteran, and I've appreciated his sage advice in that regard. Essentially, what it requires is for the North Bay counties really to come together and form an alliance, if you will. Otherwise, let's face it, San Jose, San Francisco, and Oakland are going to be pushing around the lion's share of the muscle, so to speak. What I've found is that when we do come together, we're an effective block, and we can make that case. And as you're hearing yet again here today, many of the issues are shared amongst our 4 counties in the region. So, Jim, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier about why the Bay Area is unique, and the 4 North Bay counties are very unique. And as you look at the MTC process, we try to carve out what enhances the 4 North Bay counties, and the priority conservation areas is a good example. The 4 of the North Bay commissioners, we worked hard to make it a pilot program. I can't remember the initial investment. Was it $5 million? And so you saw those enhancements. So we compete in a different way. When you look at the sales tax measure for Alameda County, Santa Clara County, San Francisco, you can't compete in that environment. And right now, those major metropolitan areas, they're absorbing a large number of this housing. They're taking a lot of pressure off of counties like the 4 North Bay counties. And I have, in the region, RM2, you look at a lot of the major projects, the Highway 12 Jamison Canyon, the truck scales, the 2 bridges. There's so many advantages that we get through a lot of the regional funds that people really kind of don't measure. But those advantages are there. I think when you look at, on a per capita basis, the 4 North Bay counties, I think, are treated very equitably through MTC. Now, we can't match the millions or billions of dollars that they're raising in sales tax or other funding sources, and so we compete differently, and so you have to consider it that way. When you look at the interest right now in the region on Highway 37, MTC has stepped up. They put about $1 million into helping us study, and so they're making it a priority within the region, and so those are the types of advantages that we get through MTC as you elevate these North Bay projects and put a real focus on it, and it brings partners like Caltrans and other agencies to the table to help us facilitate the development of these projects.
Any other questions?
favorite subject of mine. We didn't hear a lot about freight, transportation of freight, and the toll that the road takes on freight transportation. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're asking.
Yeah.
I'm interested to find out from a regional perspective the amount of number of cars or number of freight cars that go across Highway 37 and the toll that that takes, how this is such a major thoroughfare for our freight traffic.
Well, for one thing, I think a lot of the freight stays away from 37, especially in certain commute times. But, I just saw a recent photograph of the congestion. It went all the way into Vallejo, and almost every fourth vehicle was a big tractor trailer. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, there you go, right there. Boy, I told the truth.
Yes, you told the truth.
For an elected official, now I should get credit for that.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
It's a major corridor for freight, and it is, in the regional plan, we have two major freight corridors, the 880 corridor and the 80 corridor, and this is connected to that 880 corridor, and so it's an important, and that's why I had mentioned earlier, this is an important corridor to the economy of the 4 North Bay counties. And that's another reason why we need to move forward on this project, because those pressures are just building. It's not going away. The amount of freight traffic in all 3 of these corridors is just growing on an annual basis. And MTC is recognizing that. They're really, and we actually have a category now in many of our funding sources through the state that go to freight. RM3, SB1, and so they're actually recognizing that we have to invest in those corridors.
I have a question. I have a Regional Measure 3 question. Is it delineated exactly how the funding is going to go in Regional Measure 3, or is that still in flux as well as when it's going to be put on?
It's a combination. Certain things are very delineated and very project specific, and that's where a lot of the upfront work came from. In that regard, from Marin's standpoint, I'd really like to commend Transportation Authority of Marin and a lot of our public that weighed in. We feel we have some great projects in there, including Highway 37, completion of the Marin-Sonoma Narrows, the 101 North to 580 East direct highway connector that I mentioned, $135 million toward that, which ties into Richmond Bridge congestion. And then also a relocated San Rafael downtown Bettini Transit Center, $30 million toward that. Beyond that, there are some programmatic categories that will be more open, if you will. Jim can elaborate, but that regions will all be able to tap into, including alternative transit, which is very important.
No, that's a good description. I mean, they're very specific allocations, and there is flexible money.
Is there, so I've seen criticism of it from political people who normally are not critical of something like this. And the idea comes from whether or not there's equal distribution of funds among the counties.
Well, originally that was a question. We were getting a lot of pushback from Contra Costa County,
Right.
Alameda County. We feel we were able to overcome those initial objections. In fact, again, going back to our informal North Bay Alliance, we particularly were working hard with Contra Costa County to overcome a lot of their initial objections. We now, at least in regards to MTC commissioners, recently had a unanimous vote in favor of going forward with Regional Measure 3.
Yeah, there was about for both Alameda and Contra Costa County, there was about a $200 million shortfall when you look at as to how the money is generated, return to source. And so that inequity, we did balance it out, and all of the counties came together, and Damon was a big player in this, so where we all kind of looked at our projects and, shaved some of them a little bit, because that equity was very critical and very important, and it's really kind of a fairness issue, but we did find a resource to close that gap.
So that's where we are now, though.
As we are now, yes.
As you're moving forward. Well, I'm very happy to hear that, because that was...
A lot of hard work has gone into building that consensus, and we did accomplish it.
Right. And that's what I'm hearing all day, is the importance of partnership. This is all about partnerships and building consensus throughout the whole region. Any other questions before I close? No? All right. Well, thank you so very much. Thank all of you. We will be having this recording available. We'll make sure that it's on our website and that it's mailed out to anybody whose email we have. I appreciate your spending your Saturday morning with us, and look forward to our next mini league day. Bye-bye.